Bonjour, chers collègues. Bonjour tout le monde. Il m'a fait plaisir de vous rencontrer. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our session in the 13th annual conference of the Canadian Science Policy Center. My name is Vic, and it's my privilege to be here today to moderate this panel discussion. I want to start by thanking Meherdad Hariri for his tireless leadership of the Canadian Science Policy Center and then this annual conference. Year after year, Meherdad leads a team that does incredible work and brings us together in this safe, inclusive, welcoming space to have a positive and a productive exchange of ideas, creates this amazing space for knowledge sharing and professional networking. So this is my third year straight in which I've moderated and or participated in panel discussions. And every year, the quality of these conferences is just elevating at an unprecedented rate. So thank you, Meherdad, sincerely for bringing us together in such a positive way. Also, I want to say that when I look at the range of topics, the various subjects which are being discussed in the CSPC, there's just so much complementarity. There's just so much fantastic synergy and just a positivity around all the topics. So please make sure that you, certainly after attending this session, that you also attend other sessions on data and AI and all types of other interesting panel discussions and presentations on emerging technologies. So today, I'm very happy to moderate this discussion on data governance and valuation. And then in a minute, I'll welcome our esteemed guests and our distinguished panelists. But I want to set the stage a little bit for how this conversation came about and why it's important. So my name is Vic. I had the privilege of serving as Natural Resources Canada's Chief Scientist and Chief Science Advisor. And I recall a conversation I had with my Associate Deputy Minister at the time, Sean Tupper, who said that, Vic, we at the executive table, we understand how many buildings we have. We understand how many vehicles we have in our fleets. We understand how many and what types of equipment we have in our labs in Natural Resources Canada from coast to coast to coast. But when you think about intangible assets, when you think about data, do we know how much we have? Do we know what it's worth? Do we know what work it does? Do we know how we manage it? I mean, certainly there's policies from Treasury Board and there's internal information management strategies as well. But, there's a lot of times when we have documents, they're not necessarily representative of what happens in the real world. So this really triggered a very interesting series of conversations at our executive table at Natural Resources Canada at the time around, we need to start looking at data in a way that is systematic and structured vis-a-vis the notions of valuation and governance. And to me, when we think about valuation and governance, these are really two sides to the same coin. When you think about this notion of effectiveness and efficiency, let's talk about efficiency for a minute. What type of resources are we spending to acquire, to collect, to assemble, to store, to analyze, to process, to consume, to transmit data? So there's a cost involved there, and we certainly want to make sure that the costs aren't exceeding the benefits that are coming from all of those activities. So valuation is very, very important, because if we can't value data assets, data sets, databases, etc., then how do we prioritize them? How do we allocate resources towards their curation, towards their circulation, towards their consumption? So if we don't really have some systematic and structured way to measure what the worth of our data sets are, then I think we've got a bit of an issue. And it's a non-trivial problem to think about ascribing a value to data, because when you think about it, like any intangible asset, the worth of a data set is very idiosyncratic. It's very grounded. It's very contextualized. So the same data set in one department may be applied to achieve certain program or policy objectives, and in a different department may be used to apply completely different objectives. And given the fact that it's intangible, there's no stopping both departments to deploy data sets in ways that are meaningful. And the same way is when you have different data sets that each of them has a certain degree of utility in their enterprise, when you put them together, the effect of addition is actually resulting in a gain that's multiplicative or exponential. So lots of interesting research has gone on. Lots of interesting models have been proposed in the public sector, private sector, academia, around how to judge the worth of data. But this is far from a settled science. And certainly in the public sector and in NRCan, this was a subject that we looked at very, very seriously. Another side to this is effectiveness, which is where the governance piece comes into play, which is, we are in the government. And so we have to make sure that there is a degree of there is an extreme premium on, if you will, accountability and responsibility and traceability. And essentially things are done in a way that is governed and is compliant with rules and regulations, and so that everything is done in a way that is transparent and is leading to public welfare and social good. So in that context, that is the effectiveness piece, which is directly tied to the notion of governance. So when you put these two things together, which is valuation and governance, we see how important these topics are. And in that context is when I started my conversations in Ottawa with my esteemed colleagues who I'll introduce in a minute, Vidya Shankar Narayan from Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada, Raman Srivastava from Health Canada, and certainly Teresa DeAndrea from Transport Canada, is we've had conversations about these subjects and how are you doing it and what's your department looking at in terms of figuring out how to do valuation and governance of data sets. So we figured, why don't we all come together as friends and really have a thoughtful and thought-provoking conversation where all of us get to share our insights and foresight regarding this very, very important topic that, by the way, is not just relevant for the public sector, but is very relevant also for the private sector and for academic institutions alike. So enough on the context setting. I know you're waiting to hear from our very esteemed guests and distinguished leaders in the public sector. So just a quick check on the format. So I'm going to turn now to the panelists, each of whom will give a short presentation on their backgrounds and their perspectives on data valuation and governance. And this will be followed by an interactive discussion where we will delve deeper into some of the issues raised by the panelists and the audience. So without further ado, Dr. Raman Srivastava, I'd like to turn to you first. And please tell us a little bit about your role. Tell us about how you intersect with valuation and governance of data. Over to you, sir.
Wow, fascinating. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Panmarsi Baku. Indeed, a huge honor, like you said, Dr. Pant, and a great privilege to share this virtual stage with a panel of distinguished experts and share some thoughts with you all attending this very, very prestigious conference, like you said, Dr. Pant. But first of all, if I may, I would actually like to begin by acknowledging that I am, in fact, speaking from the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And like you said, Dr. Pant, in my case, I've had a fascinating and a very rewarding career with the federal public service for almost about 25 years now. I've had a unique opportunity to serve 8 federal organizations. Career, I've and have benefited from advanced data analytics and modeling work to inform and influence decision making, largely in the context of government policies, programs, and services, especially in my role as Director General of Corporate Affairs in Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, as Director General of Data Analytics at the Public Service Commission, as DG of Evaluation at the Department of National Defense, and of course now as an acting Assistant Deputy Minister and Chief Data Officer here at Health Canada. Especially, I'll say here at Health, as we continue to deal with one of the worst pandemics that Canada has ever faced. And today, what I'll do, Dr. Pant, is I will talk a little bit about the value of data in responding to COVID, and particularly as it pertains to ensuring that Canada has enough personal protective equipment, or PPEs, as part of our pan-Canadian response to the pandemic. So next slide, please, Hayden. So in terms of the context, fairly quickly, I'm sure you're all very well aware that COVID protocols in the healthcare settings created very, very strong demand for PPEs nationwide and around the world. And the federal government consolidated needs across the country to engage in bulk procurement, which in our view was essential at the time and allowed Canada to compete worldwide for very, very limited PPEs. We faced, obviously, as you can imagine, many challenges in having access to reliable information on the PPE supply and was available to us, globally, and exactly how much was needed across the country, when, and in what format. There was, of course, no central or enterprise database to estimate or to determine what was arriving from overseas and what was needed in the local context. And therefore, we realized, Dr. Pant and colleagues, pretty early in the pandemic, that there was actually a need to create a dynamic analytical model to capture the ever-changing supply and demand on the ground to quickly and also very accurately to determine what was needed to be procured and distributed across the country. Next slide, please. So in terms of the model we built, first, obviously, as you can imagine, focused on the healthcare sector, but very quickly we realized that it needed to be expanded to the rest of the economy, all the 60 broader sectors of the economy, which is what the model did. The demand for PPEs was forecasted using the epidemiological model, which I'm sure you have heard about it, and the PPE use modeling, which was based on a PPE survey that was led by our Canada. On the supply side, we estimated that using inventory and procurement data, as well as through our own modeling exercise. Next slide, please. So as you can imagine, there were, of course, many challenges as part of this process. But initially, it was, to be honest, very difficult to estimate the demand, as we were unaware of how much PPE would be needed in the coming weeks or months. And we also needed to estimate how much PPE actually was being used. We had no real way of knowing how much was actually being used, whether in the healthcare sector or in the non-healthcare sector. And the supply information was available to PTs, uh, was actually in many ways challenging, as there were various data sources that were really not quite standardized. At times, needed to be manually consolidated and validated. There was a lot of paper-based exercise. There was a lot of phone calls happening during the early part of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So in terms of the initial challenges, Health Canada and Statistics Canada obviously collaborated to develop a pretty dynamic analytical model with input from private sector experts. That, I think, in my view, allowed us to estimate current and future supply and demand for PPEs. We developed a database of protocol-based assumptions to permit us to forecast demand under various epidemiological, public health, and reopening scenarios. You will recall that the guidance was changing, the public health measures were changing, and we were trying to understand on a real-time basis what a change in the guidance, what a change in the policy, what a change in the protocol will actually mean to PPE usage, whether you are in long-term care or in a hospital setting. So, of course, this work was going on. Federal and PT partners, of course, were sharing the current and planned supply information literally on a real-time basis, as well as the usage rate, like I said, and we were updating our model on a real-time basis. Next slide, please. So obviously there were a number of enabling factors. I'll be very quick, but I must say that the PPE journey was driven by the need to address a fundamental question. And the question really was how much PPE is needed in a week, in a month, and in the next 12 to 18 months. We consolidated diverse and fragmented data from input from multiple sources, as you can imagine, to determine supply in the healthcare system across the country. As you can also imagine, this took place in a high pressure and a pretty novel environment. We established effective and agile interdepartmental and intergovernmental governance structures. We also established a pretty multidisciplinary team of talented individuals to ensure that the model was rigorous and it was reliable. Decisions were made regarding assumptions and data that were considered sufficient. Rather than in the process, we had to standardize all definitions, and as a result, were able to address issues about data quality, about integrity, about interoperability. The team was, I would say, in my view, very flexible and quite open to different sources of data that we thought could help address data gaps. We knew that something in terms of data, that is something is better than nothing to inform decision making. And of course, we continuously validated and tested our assumptions, refined our methodology, and addressed issues with data quality. Next slide, please. So, of course, there were a number of success factors, and I'm just going to talk about maybe a couple. One was, of course, like I said, establishing the key question to guide the data collection and usage, how much PP is needed, in what format, in which part of the country. I think one of the other success factors was having a flexible but yet a very strong governance structure. Strong collaboration, I would say, across the team, across the department, the health portfolio, of course, the federal and provincial partners. PTs, in my view, valued and trusted the detailed information we provided them on PPE, and we ultimately replicated this experience to vaccines and to testing. Next slide, please. So, in terms of the PPE supply and demand model, that from our point of view was immensely valuable, incredibly valuable to the entire nation. as it provided reliable and accurate information for evidence-based decision making. That was very, very critical at the time in the early days. And I think the approach used in this case could actually be used in future to help shorten the grid between problem identification and robust data analysis. So next slide is essentially my context, and thank you for taking the time to hear my story, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions. But with that, back to you, Dr. Pant.
Thank you, Dr. Srivastav. That was a very interesting sort of inside view of how, in the early days of the pandemic, and then since then, how under your leadership and those of other colleagues in the federal public service, colleagues came together and solved this big problem of PPE supply, which as you know, you and I have had a previous conversation where you made a very powerful statement which stuck with me, which was that in the early days, lots of countries were sort of troubled by the fact that there were issues around access to PPE. There were global supply shortages, there were supply chain shortages. And you said, Vic, when things got okay and people don't really talk about PPE anymore, it wasn't by accident. It's because, as Dr. Srivastav, you said, it's because you got the governance right, you got the valuation right. And then, yes, in the beginning, many countries faced that initial blip, but then Canada did a very fine job of just dynamically bouncing back from that, as you mentioned. Next, so thank you, Dr. Srivastav, for sharing your deep insights on this subject. Next, I'd like to turn to our esteemed colleague, distinguished colleague, Vidya Shankar Narayan from Agriculture. And I want to say, Vidya, what's very interesting about your organizational setup is, in different organizations, the Chief Data Office role is sort of in different sectors. I know in Natural Resources Canada, our very able Chief Data Officer reports into the ADM of Strategic Policy, a fantastic colleague. But in Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada, the Chief Data Office is a part of the Chief Information Office, which you lead. So Vidya, with that, I'll pass it to you. Please tell us a little bit about your role and how valuation and governance come into your daily life. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Vic, and I hope everyone can hear me. So good morning, everyone. Bon matin tout le monde. And I want to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nations here in Ottawa, our nation's capital. Et je vais parler en anglais, mais je suis complètement bilingue, donc pendant notre séance des questions et réponses, vous pouvez me poser des questions en français aussi. Excellent. So thank you, Vic, for that great introduction. So maybe I'll start by saying that, yes, so I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister for Information Systems and the CIO of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And one of my first, I would say, items on my mandate when I took on this job was to establish the Chief Data Office and the Chief Data Officer in my portfolio, in my organization. Second was also to bring together the data functions from across the Agriculture and Agri-Food, I would say, department, because it is not just from an information systems perspective. We are a science department. And every science department also has a chief science data lead or a chief science data officer. So I do want to say is that the chief science data officer would also be reporting into the chief data officer in Agriculture and Agri-Food. So from a governance perspective, as well as I would say organizational setup perspective, this was not an exercise of me wanting to run the empire and consolidate everything. It was more with regards to how do we actually be efficient in ensuring that we have clear accountabilities, and the chief science data officer will be working across the science portfolio. Plus, we have the economic side of the organization as well. So how do we actually cross-pollinate the data that we already own? To your point, Vic, in your intro, the amount of data each of us own, whether government or private sector. So today, I wanted to speak about 3 key areas. I may be a little provocative in what I'm going to say, but I think, Vic, that's what you expect from your panelists, and especially after Raman's excellent presentation on what was, I would say, is just outstanding and excellent work from Health Canada. From Agriculture and Agri-Food, the 3 key priorities when it comes to data, and I would say which I'm accountable for along with the Chief Data Officer in my organization, is sustainability. That's first. Second is traceability. And third is interoperability with digital systems. So I'd like to speak to each of those perhaps for a minute each, and then wrap up for continuing the work. So we've all, I would say, the last couple of weeks have been very unfortunate for different parts of our country, and everyone is aware of what is happening in BC, is whether it is on the climate aspect, but also with regards to the complete breakdown of food security. When I say food security, I'm talking about food supply chain security. So what I'm talking about here is work that we are doing right now in agriculture and agri-food in order to hopefully start getting ready by 2022 and forward. Sustainability, and the audience here, I'm sure, are already in the data realm or perhaps getting into the data realm. What I would say is that the connection between data governance, valuation, and sustainability is no small feat. I can speak about it as you, Vic, and the others for a long time, but I would just focus right now on one aspect of sustainability, and that is greenhouse gas emissions, GHG emissions. So one aspect from the sustainability model within agriculture and agri-food is ensuring that we not only just collect the GHG data, but how do we actually start applying it to our programs, services, as well as sharing the data, not just federally, but also with provinces, territories, as well as international organizations and academia, as we're working together across the country and internationally on the sustainability agenda. Whether it's GHG gas emissions coming from a certain part of our country, or whether it is actually providing that information to further develop scientific research or our economic sector or our, I would say, international relations, it really comes down to how do we ensure that this data is not just collected, but it is shared, effectively shared, and shared as real time as possible. As I said, I can go a lot deeper into the sustainability aspects, but I think I will leave it at GHG emissions and data standardization and sharing. Second is traceability. Now, traceability is, and this may be just Vidya's words here, there is traceability when it comes to food supply chains, which, as we are hearing every day right now with what is happening in BC and with the complete breakdown of supply chains. This is some work that we've actually undertaken with Raman and Raj, Thupal, and Teresa at Transport, where we're looking at agriculture, health, and transport actually being the core essential services for the country, because you need food and, of course, transportation in order to get the food across, which is where the breakdown is happening right now in parts of the country. So traceability, I may spend an extra 30 seconds on it, is because there is traceability when it comes to food supply chain. And this traceability, of course, requires a significant amount of digital infrastructure as well. But on the food supply chain traceability, it is not just, okay, we know where the food is and we know where the transportation is. You have a significant regulatory aspect in here when it comes to supply chain management and the regulations. I mean, the layers and layers of regulations that come into picture. And how do you manage the data? And how do you govern the data that is required across the different regulatory bodies, whether it's the provinces, the federal, the international? I'll give an example right now. Well, I think that trucks are going to be coming in from the US to bring in food into BC. But many of those truck drivers do not have do not have passports in order to cross the Canadian border. Another layer of regulations because they did not do this before. So when it comes to regulations and data governance and traceability for, let's say, supply chains, the layers that are added on are just getting to be, I would say, more and more complex, but also more and more real-time challenges. The other aspect of traceability, what I would like to mention here today, is environmental and social governance, where data, I've already spoken about GHG emissions in the sustainability point, so I'm going to speak more on social governance when it comes to traceability. And we know where the world is going from diversity, equity, inclusion, and Canada's 50-30 challenge with regards to 50-50 gender parity and 30% when it comes to racial minorities. And if I just take the agriculture and agri-food sector, the amount of work that needs to be done with regards to having social governance, ensuring that we really looking at the sector from the social lens is only possible with data. And that data exists everywhere. To Vic's point, we have so much data, we don't actually know where most of the data is. And then what is the value of that data? Because that data on its own is just raw. When you start layering the contextual information of, in this case, social governance, and fast forwarding to the future, we are a country where traceability of our agriculture and agri-food is going to be paramount when it comes to social governance and, of course, environmental governance and sustainability as well as we continue to export. We are an agriculture country. We have land. And the more we could actually be very upfront in our social and environmental governance data so that it can be traceable, the bigger and I would say better would be our international commerce and exports when it comes to our agriculture and agri-food products. As we all know, the next big thing that is going to be coming in is people want to know where your food is coming from, whether it's farm to table or I think it's seed to fork. They want to ensure that this is grown sustainably. There is the governance that is actually being followed by each of the industries that we're working with. Is there actual diversity, inclusion, equity as part of their governance, as part of their boards? I can go into a lot more detail, but I would think that aspect I will pause here on the traceability. And the third key point that I wanted to make was on interoperability with digital systems. And here I speak about digital systems writ large, whether it's within federal government, federal, provincial, and territorial governments, or international and academia. So what I'm currently working on with my chief data officer is working federal and provincial and territorial systems. Because when it comes to agriculture, we're just not federal government. Agriculture happens it happens across the country in provinces and territories. This interoperability, I would say, is not only the biggest challenge, but it is also going to be unlocking the biggest potential we have for sustainability and traceability. And well, ideally, it would be great to have new systems, but as someone who's been in the technology world for over 25 years, I know that we are dealing with systems that have been around for sometimes 50 years or even beyond. And when it comes to interoperability, the approach I'm taking on behalf of my organization with the provinces and territories is not to be rewriting systems, not to be investing millions into upgrading legacy systems, but focusing on how do you actually set up newer ways using blockchain, machine learning, AI, in order to extract the data and analyze and then use the data where required. Not that legacy systems is not my problem. As the CIO, I also have legacy system issues, but I'm separating the problem because the sooner and I would say quicker we are able to extract data from all the data repositories that we have federally, provincially, territorially, sometimes in the private sector, and be able to add that context. And this is where blockchain is, I would say, my best friend when it comes to traceability and sustainability. And of course, some machine learning as well, in order to ensure that we are learning from the data that we've already captured. So I'm going to pause here and leave you with sustainability, traceability, and interoperability, which hopefully in about a year from now, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada would be in a leadership role in moving the country forward on this front. So thank you, Vic. Back to you.
Thank you, Vidya, for your very illuminating comments. Thank you very much. And I think it's excellent that you talked about sustainability, transparency, and interoperability, and you gave us a lens to elevate sort of the analysis of valuation and governance, because as you mentioned, governance and valuation, we can think of them as the what, but the sustainability, transparency, and interoperability is the so what, or the why. So I think this is excellent. And also, Vidya, before I pass it to our distinguished colleague Teresa, I do want to also acknowledge that in addition to the great leadership that you've exhibited in ensuring that the core of our agricultural system is intact and working well. You mentioned food security, you mentioned access to food, but also, Vidya, credit to you for your beyond the horizon thinking on topics such as smart farming, on topics such as precision agriculture, because in the future, that's where the innovations will come from. And as the pressures on our food supply chain increase, this is where your leadership and those of colleagues in the department around blockchain, AI, IoT, drones, etc., will get to the next level. So thank you, Vidya. And now I'd like to set the stage to invite our distinguished colleague, Teresa De Andrea from Transport Canada. I recall that in my early days in Ottawa, I used to work with Julie Lees, who's a legendary leader in the IT/IM space, and she was at Transport Canada at the time, and then succeeded by the excellent Raj Thuppal, who's there now, but also working with other ADMs, Serge Benjamin and Stephanie Hebert and other colleagues at Transport Canada. I've been very favorably impressed by the caliber and by the professionalism with which they approach the creative application of innovative digital technologies to advance their science and policy integration. So in that context, Teresa, the stage is yours. Please tell us a little bit about your role and how transport approaches valuation and governance of data. Over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Vic. It's such a pleasure to be here. So I'll talk a little bit, sort of three things, a little bit about my relationship with data, Transport Canada's journey, and then why governance is so important. I think Vidya and Raman both mentioned, the importance from a Canadian perspective. But I was, first of all, I'll say, Vidya, when you were talking about traceability, I just kind of kept thinking about this, and maybe I'm dating myself, but there used to be this ad on television years ago, like maybe in the 70s or 80s, and it was, it's 11 o'clock, do you know where your children are? And I kind of have this idea of, it's 2021, do you know where your data is? And do you know how to take care of it? And I think that's sort of a theme for me in a lot of the things that we've been doing. So I'll start a little bit with my relationship with data. I've been working in, like Vidya, 25 years in the IMIT sector. So I've seen it from both sides. I've seen it from the sort of the structured data, which is something that we work very closely with the science departments, and also looking at from an information management perspective, which is more of the unstructured data, but it's still very important, and it still provides sort of a holistic picture to what we're doing. So I joined Treasury Board Secretariat probably about 7 years ago. My first job there was working on the open data side and the open government side, running their open science file. So we had 14, I think, departments and agencies which were science-based, and really trying to look at how they were addressing, the unstructured data and how they were sharing or not sharing between each other was really interesting. We have so much data, but watching, NRCan and environment and ISED and transport, trying to find ways to augment each other. Because as Vidya was saying, it's not just it isn't linear. It isn't, agriculture worries about agriculture and transport worries about transportation and Health Canada. It really is a conglomeration. We all need to, within our departments, work together. And when when COVID hit, one of the Health Canada reached out to Transport and said, can you help us mapping all of the hospitals across Canada? And we happened to have all that data because we managed the transportation of dangerous goods. So being able to see which, and of course, the hospitals all have transport in and out dangerous goods. So we were able to very quickly, like this, pull together a map of all the hospitals across the country. So that's the kind of integration that we need to see. And I think it's the more and more, and one of the benefits of being a Treasury Board Secretariat was really being able to see across all the different departments and really seeing those synergies and how that data really needs to support everyone across the board, and with the provinces and with other jurisdictions, and also internationally, right? Being able to share data with our colleagues in the US or in Europe or in Asia is really important. So when we talk about Transport Canada, just like everyone else, we're trying to get a handle on our data. We haven't figured it out. We don't have, sort of the perfect recipe, but we're working, and I see every day, I see, a movement towards a more digital and a more data enabled future. So we do have a strong history of using data. We are actually one of the oldest departments within the government, within the federal family. So we've had people doing amazing things with data for a very long time. What it's been, though, it's been very paper-based, right? So having an analyst sitting down with, their spreadsheets spread across the, their table, and, trying to make sense of the data is typically how we've gotten along, and we've been doing it very well. Our statisticians and our data scientists, they know data. What's been missing is that digital aspect. So imagine what we can do with that compute power that exists today, right? Rather than someone sitting down and looking at spreadsheets, within milliseconds you can have compute power of petabytes and petabytes of data and make sense of them, right? So that's where we really are trying to push things. We're trying to also merge service and data. So when I joined Transport Canada about 5-6 months ago, I was given the data file, and then shortly thereafter, the service file was moved into my area. And I remember at the time thinking, service data, like those are two separate things. How am I going to merge the two? And the more I've been thinking about it, the more I've been working through it, the realization is that, a service is nothing more than data walking through a process to ultimately deliver some sort of a business value. Right? So how can we then look at user experience, whether it's an inspector that's going out to, inspect an airport, or it's a citizen, or it's a business, Air Canada. How can we ensure that user experience is the best possible experience out there, right? How can we make sure that the processes are lean? And a lot of that, right? It's data walking through a process, but also leveraging data to make sure that those experiences and those services that we deliver are excellent. So that's something that we're really trying to sort of pivot towards, is data, not just for decision-making, but as part of a larger, broader service delivery. So why is governance so important? So I think, both of my colleagues talked a little bit about, what's been happening through COVID and what we've been, how we've been supporting and how we've been helping. And I think at the end of the day, having that governance framework helps pull it all together. So whether it's the, supporting the economy or, supporting us through COVID, I think that's where we really are able to come together and really shine when it comes to our data. But being able to manage it is really important. So 3 things that my team does. One is, I call it sort of rules, tools, and then insights. So on the rules side, we really have, we have a team that does amazing work putting together, governance frameworks, things like ethical use of AI, putting together data standards, service standards, a data strategy and an implementation plan, master data management, interoperability, and setting the rules for all of those things. Our tools team is really around the platforms. So it's all cloud-based, and really being able to leverage that compute power that I was mentioning, right? Data lakes, ingesting petabytes of data, doing some, cleansing of the data, and being able to then make sense of it, see it from an analytics perspective, creating visualizations, that sort of thing. And then the insights is really about understanding that what your data is saying. What's the story that it's telling you? Why does that matter? And then not just this is what's happened in the past, or this is what's happening today, through visualizations, but also what's going to happen in the future. How can we predict what's going to happen down the road? That's really exciting as well. So those are sort of the three things that we're looking at right now. When we talk about the economy, the flooding that's happening in BC right now. So our rails are closed, highways are washed out. So as we know, most of our goods come from East Asia. So how can data help that, right? How can we understand our environment? How can we help, Vidya? How can we help Ramon's team? How do we get goods moving across Canada? Can we find alternative routes? Our aircraft services, for example, are flying overhead and they're mapping out the entire flood area. They have the sensors in the aircraft that have, the special abilities to do that. So how can we then work with Vidya's team to make sure that they can actually see that visual, right, from the data on what's happening on the ground, understanding from Environment Canada how quickly, you know, will this dissipate? When will the roads be available again? When will rail be able to be back up? And then what kind of goods are being shipped? Are there alternative routes? Can we, you know, those are all the things that data can help us, right? We can predict, we can look, we can see and model different scenarios. What if we did this? And then we can come up with sort of a best case scenario to ensure that citizens, you know, have food, have the goods that they need, are able to travel and that sort of thing. When it comes to things like predictive analytics, one of my favorite stories, and I apologize if anyone, I think it's so cool. One of the things that we look at are we track whale pods and whale movement in the Atlantic. We monitor their movements, and based on that, we have an algorithm that sort of predicts where they're going to move next, where they're going to be next. So one of the things that we do predict where that whale movement will be, and then we can alert the Coast Guard, who then reaches out to ships in that area saying, be on the lookout. There may be whales. We predict that there will be a whale pod in your area shortly, right? Like something simple like that, but it's really cool. Data allows you to do that, right? Allows you to do the modeling, allows you to do the predictive, and allows you to also understand where you are today so that you can make those decisions. And when we look at governance, right? So sort of coming back to the value and the governance, it's really about having that framework to decide when you're looking at master data management, what is your authoritative source? I'll tell you right now on things like stakeholder management, which doesn't seem like a big thing, every single group has an Excel spreadsheet with their list of stakeholders that they're trying to manage. But suddenly, you know, you have a prime minister who says, okay, everyone, you know, all of our airlines and our rail systems and marine have to now report in on their vaccination of their employees. Well, suddenly that stakeholder list that everyone seems to have, we need to have one consolidated. So whose list is the right one, right? Everyone seems to have a piece of it. So you need that governance to say, okay, this is the authoritative source. This is what we're going to be using going forward. And you know, then you build out the support underneath it through a catalog or whatnot. And again, even if it is just this is the master spreadsheet for now until we get to a point where we have a system, that's what governance is for. It's who goes first when you have a whole list of you know, data visualizations. Everyone wants data visualizations. Which ones are the most important ones? Which ones land on the deputy minister's desk, you know, every single day? Which ones are the ones that the media is asking for, that they want, you know, updates on? That's the kind of stuff that governance, you know, if with everything else that it does, if it can help prioritize and it can help streamline and it can help, you know, identify what those main points are, I think if nothing else, that's your purpose of the governance. And it often is the last thing that people focus on, but from my perspective, it really needs to be one of the first. So I think I'm going to end it there because I'm sure there are people with lots of questions, and I'd like to, I'm looking forward to the panel part.
Thank you very much, Teresa, for an excellent explanation of kind of how transport approaches its initiatives in such a comprehensive way. And I really found it interesting. You talked about the rules, the tools, and then I thought you were going for schools, but actually it was insights. So that was fascinating. You know, just before we get to the panel, a few things that were so stunning to me, and they really emphasize how well the federal family works together. You know, a couple of themes that came to my mind in the presentations that our experts gave us today. One is just this notion of collaboration, how in every example from each of the colleagues we heard how they're working with other departments. So there isn't that siloing, there isn't that stovepiping. It's one big federal family. Everybody comes together and works towards these big picture goals. And speaking of big picture goals, that's the second thing that resonated with me, was that the government is really the forum where big problems are being solved in creative, innovative ways, whether we talk about food security, whether we talk about pandemic preparedness and response, whether we talk about global climate change, adaptation, mitigation, media remediation, etc. So really interesting that the federal family works together as one unit, that these big problems are being solved collectively and by really leveraging the cumulative insights. And really also, as all the colleagues mentioned here, is the focus on first principles. In software industry, which is my core background, sometimes there is this interest in focusing on sort of the latest and greatest, and that's fine because the software industry evolves and changes so quickly that it is quite nice to look at the latest and greatest things. But really making sure that we crawl, walk, run, is that we don't just sort of look at the shiny new object every time, and we really build a sustainable, scalable strategy to move towards the application at scale of these breakthroughs. So really interesting themes that are cross-cutting and go across everything that our experts talked about. So now I'd like to switch to the panel, and I'd like to start the first question, Dr. Srivastav, with you. So as you mentioned in your intro, you've had a very diverse and eclectic background in the federal family. You've worked in various departments. You've been a part of teams that have solved big problems. Now you are the acting ADM and Chief Data Officer at Health Canada. Tell us a little bit, Dr. Srivastav, about your experience with the PPE challenges, which you talked about and solved with data. What are some of the lessons that you learned there that can be applied more broadly in other aspects of health, but also more broadly across the other departments and agencies in the federal family?
Well, that's a big question, Dr. Pant. But like I said, in terms of our experience and my experience in Health Canada, I think one thing that became very clear, and our colleagues were talking about that, is to step back if it is possible and think about the empirical question, to think about the policy question, think about the program question. I think sometimes we get the software and the system and what have you. But I think what worked in our case for the most part was kind of stepping back and talking about what is the empirical question that we're trying to solve. And I think in the context of whether it is climate change or agriculture, food security, or what have you, these are very large, complex problems for sure. But I think I will suggest, that the very first thing would be to think about the big question. I think in terms of the PP experience, like I said, the billion-dollar question really was like, why are we embarking on this data journey? And what do we want and need to learn? And I think from my point of view, from our point of view, the scientific data I think offers a tremendous opportunity to address the real problems in practical ways, and we can have various ways of dealing with that. We were talking to our colleagues just the other day about the indigenous health data or just health data, very great large, and we said, well, okay, just PHAC and Health Canada can get together. We know everything about health data. And 30 seconds later, we said, actually, it's much more complex than that. I think you cannot talk about health unless you're talking about homelessness, unless you're talking about poverty, unless you talk about food security, unless you're talking about many other things, substance abuse, long-term clearing, mental health. I think the point I'm trying to make, which I think my colleagues, both Vidya and Teresa, have made very eloquently, is I think we need to kind of step back and think about the what and why and what and so what, and think more broadly about what else do we need to be able to solve these problems. So I just kind of say that we look at the big empirical question, we look at what data are we talking about, where does it sit, and the last part I'll make, Dr. Bint, very quickly, and I'm very big on that, is data to me is not just quantitative, it's also qualitative. So when we talk about the indigenous health data, in fact, we are reminded many, many times that we cannot have a meaningful conversation on health or indigenous health in particular unless we're talking about storytelling, the context, the background, so that the importance of that context is equally important. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Dr. Pant.
Thank you, Raman. That was excellent. And I completely agree with you. Even at NRCan, we were building these frameworks to ascribe a value or the worth of a data set. If you look at it purely from a quantitative, objective perspective, you miss so much value that is subjective and qualitative that you would be really remiss in appropriating or leveraging that value. So thank you for that. Vidya, I'd like to turn to you next. And I'd like to ask you, you talked about sustainability and you talked about traceability, you talked about interoperability. Tell us a little bit, Vidya, about what are some of the things that data governance and valuation have to do with sustainability, interoperability, and traceability in your experience?
Thank you, Vic. And so I'm going to actually continue from where Raman left off, where it's telling the story.
I think we may have lost Vidya.
You can't hear me?
I can hear you, Vidya.
Yeah.
I can hear you.
So you can hear me. And because I heard Teresa saying that she may not be able to hear me, but okay, so Vic, you still hear me. So Raman spoke about one of his last few words in the question was on telling the story. And that's where I'm going to pick up from is when I mentioned my 3 key points. I mean, at the end of the day, it is about knitting that story together. And that story is not just within each department and within each portfolio within a department, or it's not even just everything. Not the entire story is not even within the federal government. It's with multiple levels of government, with academia, it's with the private sector, etc. So I'm going to actually go to what has been happening in the country since the pandemic hit. And yes, data governance and the value of data, we have been talking for a long time about the importance, but the world has changed. It's soon to be 2 years since the pandemic hit. It's just a matter of a few months away. And the priorities and measuring the impact of how the world actually conducts itself is not only become important, it's actually become critical. The reason we're talking about sustainability so much right now and traceability and interoperability, etc., is because there is real impact to the day-to-day lives of our Canadians, but also I'm talking about from a global perspective, the global citizens. So your question, Vic, was, what are the key aspects happening in each of these areas? So on sustainability, it's, as I said, is I'm not Environment and Climate Change Canada. I'm Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. However, I'm across every part of this country. I have, when I say me, my department, we have labs and research and development centers in remote and rural locations collecting data. Vic and I have spoken over the last year with regards to, it doesn't matter which department you are or which scientific research lab you are, you're collecting data that is extremely valuable to somebody else. ECCC, Environment and Climate Change Canada, may not have the same locations that I have, or Raman does, or the data that Transport Canada does, or NRCan does. But the challenge is that we've not been sharing it, and sharing it with the right lens, or I should say, right may not be the best word, with the standards, and I call it the blueprint. So the reason I say blueprint is there's a lot of data being collected and not changing how we collect data, but actually applying the lens that we need to apply in order to be able to share the data and use it. Traceability, I know, so traceability is basically almost my favorite topic in everything I do in my day-to-day job, because, and I think I landed in the right department for it, because as we are moving forward, whether it's traceability for food supply chains or traceability for food security, for which we work with Canadian Food Inspection Agency, or traceability when it comes to export of our food products to other, I would say, to other countries, to other economies, whether it's traceability when it comes to environmental and social governance and sustenance on that front. Traceability is going to be the absolute key factor as we move forward when it comes to data. And as I said, can talk a lot about this, and I'm sure my co-panelists would also be able to jump in on this, because this is where the interoperability with systems becomes almost even, because without that interoperability, we are not able to do much with the data we have. And there's multiple ways of doing it, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. And in my previous jobs, I have been at Employment and Social Development, not environment. I have been at Treasury Board. I have been at ISET. I've been in different government departments. And it's just a fascinating place to say that every department is actually part of this whole, I think Teresa called it the consortium, and I fully agree with that, is because we're not working in silos. We just cannot work in silos. And this is where the interoperability within the government, but also when I mentioned the term blueprint, is that matters, is because we cannot be changing legacy systems. And we also cannot use system challenges as an excuse, because it is no longer an excuse. I take the banking example. Banking systems, if any of you have gone behind the screen in banks and seen how their systems look, they are sometimes look green in color and like they were written in DOS. Maybe they were in DOS. But what you see is very slick online banking because the data is actually being shared behind the scenes. I'm not saying banks are doing a perfect job, but they're doing a pretty good job with regards to data interoperability within, of course, their own banking systems. Our job is significantly more complex because now we're talking about breaking down silos and creating blueprints, which is Teresa referred to it as frameworks. I think Raman spoke to it as from a governance perspective. I think it's just, I would say, different names we're using. Is without that, I don't see us being able to be ready for the future that we're already in. And my last word here is digital and data are two sides of the same coin because you cannot be doing digital without data. Thank you.
Thank you, Vidya, and completely agreed. Digital and data, absolutely, there is that upstream downstream relationship, but as you indicated, it's more complex than that because you have data that goes into digital processes, digital systems, and then new data are created, and so on and so forth. And conversely, also with the systems, as the systems are using data, but they're also analyzing data, creating new data as a result of it. Thank you, Vidya. Excellent food for thought there. Teresa, I'd like to turn to you next. I understand maybe there may be a slight audio issue, so we'll type the question in chat for you as well. But the question for you is, Teresa, traditional governance versus adaptive and agile governance. You talked about sort of the tools, the rules, and the insights. When you look at traditional governance versus adaptive and agile governance, which one in your professional experience is better when it comes to managing data?
So I think, yeah, adaptive and agile all the way. I think, as you know, traditional governance was fantastic through the Industrial Revolution and in that era. I think having that very, militaristic, having a hierarchy, having someone at the top making all the decisions while they're building a dam or they're constructing highways. I think any kind of building or physical, having a very sort of project management waterfall beginning and an end, and having all the decisions being made at the very top was fantastic. And I still think it's very important for let's say you're putting on the Olympics and you need to have there's a definitive beginning, there's a definitive end, and you need to sort of organize things a certain way. I think when it comes to our business and being very digital, it just requires a different mindset, and it requires a different form of governance. And I think having a governance that allows you to pivot quickly, where all of the power doesn't sit at the very top, decisions can be made, you sort of delegate down those decisions, and it's all about risk. So if you have decisions that need to be made at the ground level, if you again looking at delivering on a certain product, like for example, we're putting together, we have applications that support our inspectors. So when they go out in the field and they go through their inspection list, they can fill it out, and then it creates reports, and there's sort of an automated workflow that's a part of that. So when we look at something like, do we really have time to wait? Like if someone's developing something or they're leveraging the data, do we really have time to see when the next time there's an ADM committee and then having to go up the chain and ask the questions and then it comes back down? We don't have time for that. In a digital world, we need to pivot quickly and we need to move quickly. So being able to make sure that those decisions are being made at the right levels, and sort of empowering our staff to take a risk. If they have 70% of the information on something, they can go ahead and make a decision, right? And I think important. And adaptive is also important because things shift all the time. What I put in place today is not going to be the same governance that's going to be working in a year from now, right? So being able to adapt and to pivot, and as things evolve, bring new people in, send some people saying, sorry, we've been wasting your time. There's very little value in you being here. And really being able to take that approach when it comes to our governance, I think will yield better results in the long term.
Thank you, Teresa, and certainly just to add to that as well, when we look at data sets, as Vidya and Raman and yourself have mentioned, no one organization has all the data they need to effect the decisions they need to. So we're going to have to work with other organizations, and so if if we have very rigid and very unchanging and fixed and inflexible types of processes and procedures, then it's going to make it all that much harder to engage in innovative types of collaborations with others who may have relevant data sets. So I wasn't surprised when you said you're going with adaptive and agile all the way, but I still felt the need to ask you, Teresa. Thank you for that. So Dr. Srivastav, I want to ask a question. You said something in the previous response that really stuck with me, where you said, oftentimes when we're solving one problem in front of us, we may lose track of the surrounding sort of context of contributing factors, of driving factors which are around it. And I just want to quickly refer back to an interesting panel discussion I was on with Mr. Anil Arora, the chief statistician of Canada. And he made a comment where he said, when you look at studies of somebody's highest level of education achieved, the question is that a sort of socioeconomic indicator or analysis, or is that a health indicator or analysis? Because there is a correlation between the highest level of education achieved by somebody, then whether or not they become, whether or not it's correlated to whether they smoke or not, that can then have implications for their children. So the thing is, as you said, Dr. Srivastav, that, when you are solving a problem right in front of you, you still need to look at it from an impact assessment, cumulative, longitudinal perspective. And that may require integrating data sets, that may require unifying or aggregating or coalescing data sets, as you've already mentioned. But I want to approach this question from a slightly different direction, which is the question of privacy. So in your professional experience, Dr. Srivastav, how do we navigate the privacy aspects of integrating data sets? What are some of the potential pitfalls and challenges?
Yeah, no, thank you, Dr. Pant. But if I may, with your permission, just maybe one tiny second, I want to go back to the excellent point that my colleague Teresa mentioned. I mean, I fully concur with her in terms of the need for us to think about the governance grid large. Like, we just can't have the militaristic view about that. The only thing I'll mention very quickly, though, I think there may be some circumstances where you may need a little bit of a balance of the two. And the reason I'm saying that is, as a new CDO, I'm learning that oftentimes there are more than one players in the data area, and I think it may not be a bad idea to have a conversation about authorities' roles and responsibilities, who does what, so we can have a conversation about the rules of engagement and clarify who's going to be lead in terms of data standardization and privacy, what have you. But just want to make a quick mention that in the context of PPE, I mean, we would still be writing a 100-page long proposal on data model if it wasn't because of the agile and the very flexible data governance that we had in Health Canada. Having said that, in terms of the privacy, I think one thing that is very clear to all of us public servants, and that is non-negotiable, is the respect for privacy. I think we know that. I think it's kind of given. The respect for privacy is clearly paramount, and is something that is going to challenge us to find, I guess, better and innovative ways, quite frankly, to deal with that. I think we have now a number of tools, a lot of technology that can help you with anonymization of data. We can find ways to gauge the levels of access. I mean, our colleagues in Chess Canada have these, they call the linked file environments that offers a various degree of security. So given you Dr. Pant and I'm Raman and somebody's Vidya and somebody Teresa, they can actually monitor who gets access what. So I think that is clearly possible. I don't think in 2021 going forward it's going to be either privacy or data access. I think it's going to be both. I think we'll have to just put our resources and our thinking cap together as federal government, public sector organization, where we're talking about privacy and data access. Because this is something where security, data access, and privacy are going to have to go hand in hand. But I think there's lots of tools and technology that is available to do that. And my final point, Dr. Pant, will be to exactly what you mentioned, that you pick any issue, most of the issues, whether it's social, economic, international, what have you, they're not department specific. They're not, province A or B or federal government. I think it's going to take, I think you mentioned, very collaborative approach between the different levels of government, between different departments, and health. You mentioned about the fact that you cannot talk about substance abuse just by talking about health. It is the social determinants of health. And you're very right. It is your income level. It is your education level. It is where do you live. We now have disaggregated data where we can track and predict the human health based on the postal code that you live in and the education that you have. So I think science is evolving and the knowledge is evolving, but you're absolutely right. We'll have to look at the data that is available. And my last point will be about not to forget about the qualitative data. That's absolutely critical. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Srivastav. Yes, I completely agree with you. Also, in terms of the tools and technologies, I was in another session last week, and we talked about various breakthroughs in privacy-preserving technologies like homomorphic encryption and differential privacy and secure multi-party computation and trust environment execution. So you're right that in machine learning context, but even outside of machine learning and AI context, there's a number of ways in which you can anonymize and de-identify data sets in a way that they are still useful for analysis, but they preserve various aspects of privacy protections in place. So thank you, Dr. Srivastav. That's great. Vidya, I'd like to turn to you for the next question. And you talked a lot about, interestingly, about the opportunities and sort of some of the benefits that come when we have sustainability, when we have traceability, interoperability. But what are some of the challenges, Vidya? Because when you came in, you've restructured the Office of the Chief Information Office. You've now created the Chief Data Officer role, Chief Science Data Liaison. So from a cultural perspective, from a structural perspective, Vidya, tell us a little bit about some of the challenges involved.
Sure. Thank you, Vic. So I'm going to start with, I think Teresa mentioned this mindset. And the mindset is, because we can say a shift in mindset or a change in mindset, but we do know that at the end of the day, it comes down to culture. And so the number one challenge, which continues to be, however, I'd say, is that every day is a day of progress for anyone, whether you're sitting in my department or other departments, is because there is a significant shift that is happening around the world. And what happened in 2020, 2021, I basically usually say that what was going to happen over the entire decade of the 2020s happened in about 12 to 18 months. So there's been a significant acceleration of digital as well as the dependency on data. The mindset is still catching up because human beings, we're all set in our ways. And specifically in data, and this happens more often than not because I've been spending a lot of time with my colleagues and my deputy minister when it comes to data and data sharing. Not just data sharing for the sake of sharing, but to measure efficiencies, to measure impact, and to actually, when we've been talking about evidence-based decision-making, I think for decades in the public service, which requires real data, which sometimes requires big data. So on challenges, so the number one challenge that has been mindset and shifting the mindset, but shifting it in a way that we also explain why. So what? Because not focusing that much on the how. The reason is the how can sometimes be very challenging depending on the teams, the organizations we are working with. Not everyone has grown up with a digital savvy mindset or even with a technology background. But the what and the so what and the why when it comes to mindset has been, I would say, the best recipe at my end in order to be shifting mindsets and setting up. I would say it's almost been a negotiation where we don't have multiple data officers and multiple data offices in my portfolio. We are consolidating the functions, but not consolidating data. So this is where my second aspect is going to be on the second challenge, but opportunity is data ownership. It was very interesting when I started in this job now, it's over a year ago, where people were like, oh, she's now going to own all the data. It's because that has been a concept that has been in mindsets for decades, where whoever is accountable, they own all the data. They decide what to do with the data. Yes, there is governance. Yes, we have steering committees. But that's a mindset that doesn't exist anymore in reality. Data ownership, when Raman spoke to us about the PPE work and the agile governance and decision making, is I highly doubt Raman owned any of that data. Is he was working with data from literally around the world. It's because so that mindset, which is now translating into data ownership, it was a significant item that I had to continuously communicate to overcome. Still a work in progress, but I would say in the recent weeks, a lot of progress, because I think when it comes to mindset shift and also communication of what do we mean by as we're moving forward, takes a little bit of time. So I would say is be resilient, do not give up. Also, it takes, I think we've heard about, is it culture eats transformation for breakfast, is what these are expressions from the past. I have actually chosen to consider them as legacy expressions, because the way I look at it is not everyone has been working in the world of digital and data for that long. They have basically been using paper and Excel spreadsheets, to Teresa's point, with all the paper that is around. And when you say, hey, guess what? We're going to have a chief data officer and a chief science data officer, and we're going to be sharing data and using blockchain and AI, it is extremely scary. So that's the third point I have to say, is that it's because fear is real. And this is not fear of transformation. This is fear of actually not understanding the whole picture or even part of that picture, and fear of what does it mean for me? How am I actually going to be playing in this? And am I going to lose complete control of my data? Is it somebody else who's going to take this data and decide to shape shift it into something else? So data ownership, this is an aspect that I speak about at every meeting that I discuss data. Fear is another aspect I bring up. I bring up fear. I don't expect anyone else to bring it up. Recently, when I brought up fear, my boss, who was the deputy minister, he smiled and he said, I'm so happy that you actually brought it up, because it is scary. It is scary for me as well. It's not something that we can do easily. And the final challenge I would say, Vic, that I'd like to mention is not just sharing amongst the federal government partners. I'm actually not that concerned about it, because we have great collaboration, may not come across that way. It's the collaboration and the sharing across jurisdictions, as well as the private and public sector partnerships, which is where a lot more work needs to get done. And that's going to be even scarier, but at the same time, let's take it one day at a time. Thanks.
Thank you, Vidya. I know Teresa has also has some great points to make on mindset and culture. I just want to make a quick reaction, Vidya. Agree with everything you said. And on the mindset side, I recall that when I came into NRCan, I looked at the org chart, and it's that circa 1960s style org chart with kind of that hierarchical top-down branching tree pattern. And it's very interesting that later on, I had interactions, Vidya, to your point, with various software vendors who, in fact, make the platforms that public officials collaborate using, whether it's instant messaging, whether it's emailing, etc. And they showed me a graph. They showed me a network diagram where the edges represented individuals or teams, and the nodes represented individuals or teams, and the edges represented the frequency of their communication, or the nodes represented, let's say, some topics. And what's interesting is they said to me that, look, the deputy ministers or the heads of organizations think that the department operates along that hierarchical branching tree top-down model, but this is actually how the public sector actually collaborates, is where groups within NRCan are talking on a daily basis to groups within ECCC and agriculture and transport. So I think it's really that awareness. I think it's really that that ability to reframe expectations and say, wow, look, today technology gives us the ability not just for people to exchange emails and instant message and do video meetings, but we can actually analyze that in a privacy protecting way, not down to the individual level, but down to a team or a topic level, and see how work is flowing across the entire federal family. And then we can use that to back out governance questions and valuation questions around data as well. So when you said that, Vidya, I couldn't resist the temptation to first of all put it out there that there are these kinds of analytics which are available to leaders in the enterprise such as yourselves. But Teresa, over to you. I know you have some interesting perspectives to share on mindset and culture as well.
Yeah, and I mean, and Vidya and I have been at this for a while, and we've been, championing, and it's, and I think it really resonates what she was saying about fear and change. And I look at myself, even though we have been, such champions of digital for, at least the last decade, if not the last 2 decades. We recently a SharePoint, we're bit by bit switching over off of our RDIMMs and for our records management. And I'll tell you, I've been having the hardest And I've been resisting the change, even though I know it's right and I know it's the right. I've been resisting it because it means I have to learn something new and I have to figure out, like, even though RGIMS is, it's, I don't know how many decades old it is, and it's such an antiquated system, and I know how to work in it. So now I have to learn this new thing, and you don't save documents, you just make the changes, and there's no save, and it's so confusing. And I find even in myself, like, there's a resistance, right? I will save a document in my local directory and mail it to someone before I change it in SharePoint. And that's such a small thing. And so now then I turn around and I turn to an entire, like, the civil aviation unit and say, all right, y'all going to be working a completely different way from now on. Good luck with that. Bon chance. That's not fair, right? We are humans. There is fear. There is, I like my creature comforts. I like, once I know how to do a thing, I don't want to have to change. And I think one of the approaches we're taking, and I can't say this is, the best approach we haven't through yet, so maybe I'll come back next year and let you know how it's going. But one of the things that we're really looking at is setting up to go in and help our teams digitize their services, right? So look at the service, looking at the data. Where's your data coming from? Is it clean? Where else can you be getting data from? Is it the authoritative source? Like, walking through an entire service or an entire use case with the teams and showing them, this is where your data is collected. This is how, and walking them through that, I think has been, I'm hoping will be help shift the mindset and help shift the way they think and how they approach data, so that next time it's not so scary. Because I mean, for me, what the best thing was for my SharePoint fears and woes was sitting down with someone, having them walk me through it and show me how to use it and say, oh, look, it's this simple. You can open it, you can do this. And I kind of went, oh yeah, that's not so bad, right? And I think that's part of our role as CDOs, is to really help take people by the hand and walk them through the process, rather than pushing it on them and saying, okay, bon chance, allez-y. So that's sort of my impression. But yeah, I completely agree. It's tough. It's tough. There's a lot of fear.
Thank you, Teresa. That's great. Colleagues, I'd like to the audience, to our members that are kindly watching this panel discussion. The floor is open. Please ask your questions in the discussion forum. We'll try to take as many as we can before the top of the hour. But you've heard some great comments, some great thoughts from our distinguished leaders in the public service. Please ask your questions. While those questions are coming in, maybe Vidya, I can turn to you and ask a quick follow-up question. So in terms of balancing sort of some of the long-term interventions with some of the short-term quick wins, if you will, what would be some kind of advice that you would like to give technology, well, in general, leaders? How do you balance sort of some of the long-range view and planning with some of the shorter-term types of quick wins in this context?
Sure. Thank you, Vic. Maybe I'll give some it's actually real world examples that I'm dealing with right now. Let's focus on choosing some high impact use cases, or to say high impact when it comes to the people and when it comes to measuring efficiency. So that is my number one recommendation I would give, is we cannot do this all overnight or even within 1 year. I think my journey is, I've laid out a journey of about 5 to 7 years ahead, and knowing that in 5 to 7 years, a lot changes. Because the reason I say choose some high impact use cases with some wins within the next 12 to 18 to 24 months is because a lot is changing as we're speaking. Digital is moving way quicker than it has ever done in the past. And two aspects that we've not yet spoken about today. One is experimentation, and the other is innovation. So my second recommendation would be, let's experiment to innovate, because we really can't solve everything overnight. And that is also very stressful, scary, and adoption of a change in mindset takes a long time. But how about we start with experimenting, and experimenting either to achieve key impacts as well as experimenting to innovate our thinking, but also innovate how we are approaching data governance. In my world, sustainability and traceability, but depending on the worlds you're in, it would be for different impacts. And I leave the floor with experimenting, because I think everyone can experiment more than what we've been doing so far.
Thank you, Vidya. I remember, Teresa, you and I had a great conversation with Raj recently, and you used the exact same reasoning, Teresa, when you mentioned the importance of use cases, and you specifically said you're really not interested in talking to the business leaders or the organizational leaders and talk about, hey, let's show you data science, let's show you machine learning, but really, what's the problems you're solving, what's the use cases, and now let's talk about fitting the capabilities from your tools, if you will, to meet those organizational objectives. Teresa, would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's hard. It's a hard thing to look at, from, to Vidya's point. This isn't something that's going to change in, today or tomorrow, but it's small and it's progressive, but it has been accelerated. And I think what we're is sort of these big blanket motherhood statements like, be good stewards to your data, take care of your data. And everyone goes, yes, absolutely agree. Sorry, what am I supposed to do? Like, how do I do that? Oh, yes, we've got policies. Here are our policies, read through. Okay, yes. So they read through the policies and they're like, okay. And then they get the question of, we need like stakeholder. I'll come back to that example. We need to know who are your main contacts at Air Canada. And you're like, okay. And you go into your little spreadsheet that you have on your own, and you're not making that connection between this policy that I read over here and the work that I'm doing day to day. Trust is another issue. There's fear, but there's also trust, where you look at, I have my stakeholder list because I know the people I need to deal with. I don't trust my neighbor to take care of that list, right? Like, because what if it's lost? What if their data is wrong? What if they have the wrong phone number for this contact, right? Then all of a sudden we can't contact them anymore. What if the name drops off? Well, there's this distrust that we have as well. And I think, so where we've been, like I mentioned, trying to pivot is like, okay, give me your use case from beginning to end, from soup to nuts. Let's look at that. Let's explore it. Let's see, understand the user. Where is the data coming from? What data can we pull in? Is your process a good process? Is there or is it like a 30-year-old process that you're trying to, match your data to? Or are there opportunities for us to automate? Can we apply AI for some decision making within that process that just sort of alleviates people's, having to go in and a large chunk of work? When we start talking about automation, and you need data for that, right? Can we those administrative, that burden that we all have, so that we can actually free people up to do really cool work, right? The stuff that they signed up for. I mean, as a DG, I hate to admit, I spend a good portion of my day doing administrative work, right? Like, that's not necessarily, I want to be strategic. I want to be thinking, right? Everyone does that. No one signs up to do administrative work. So can we automate some of that so that we can be, more creative and more strategic and really focus on the things that matter? So it's all a part, and you can't just look at the data and not look at the process. You can't look at the data and not look at the user experience at the end. So I feel like all these pieces just fit so nicely together. And the best way to have that conversation, take someone by the hand and say, okay, let's walk through your use case and let's start looking at, the various pieces. And when you get to the point where you're talking about the service standards, then you can point to your policy and say, oh, see, we've already outlined it here in our policy. This is what we expect for service standards. So we'll just apply that here. Or when we're talking about data stewardship, thing, right? What does it mean to be a good data? What it means, and this is what it means in your context with your data that you've collected.
Thank you, Teresa. So Vidya and Teresa, I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. We have about 6 left. So there's two questions that have come in, and why don't I pose both questions to both of you? And Vidya, we'll go to you first. Please pick either one you wish and answer it, and then Teresa, same request for you, and that way we can wrap up in time and be respectful of the schedule of this great conference. So the first question that came in is, given the speed at which things are moving, how can we ensure that we balance culture change with some of these other priorities we've been discussing throughout today? That's one question. You can feel free to answer that if you wish. The second question drills down, double clicks on the issue of fear. And so the question is, what are some strategies to help colleagues tame the fear, if you will? And can you share some insights in that way? So Vidya, over to you. Please pick either of these questions, and we'll go to Teresa next.
So Teresa, since I got the first item, so I'm going to actually tackle fear and strategies, and I'll be quick on that one as well. So excellent question. And I know that Teresa also spoke about fear and trust. So I will speak maybe a couple of sentences on that. So here I'm just going to jump to some examples. All of us, whether it's fear from our end or whether we've seen the fear around us, and this is real. And I always look at is the fear is coming from a variety of reasons. Fear is coming from challenges in understanding digital and data, in awareness, in challenges in what would it take to be able to adopt. Things that we have not yet spoken about today because it's a short forum is how much is it going to cost? There's fear of how are we going to actually find the money to fund this? There's also a fear of where are we going to find the skills? I mean, I'm hearing so much about people, about the significant shortage in the workforce. And I know that Canada as a country, in the next 3 years, we need 3 million new people in the field of digital and data. 3 million new. Our population, that is basically, I would say, just less than 10% of our population. So the fear is real from skills, from funding, from culture change adoption. There's also trust, is the fear of actually trust, is what data do I trust? Now, strategies, I would say, is call out the fears. It's actually be bold and call out the fears, saying you may not even have the full list of the fears. So be open when you're working with your partners. Say, these are the fears I already know that even I have. Are there other fears that I've actually not captured? Second is looking at what fears that you could actually slowly start mitigating. Maybe it's the fear of trust. Maybe it's fear of cybersecurity. It's fear of, okay, it's an interesting fear that I've heard a lot about is if we have more automation and AI and blockchain, I may have to let go of some of my people. I may have to fire some people because machine will be taking over. So calling out the fears is first. Second is which fears do you actually want to tackle? Which are the fears that you want to look at, I would say, some remediation measures or measures to actually face them? And I'd say number 3 is do not do this alone. As a leader in digital tech, and of course, as I said, is after setting up the chief data officer role in my organization, the one thing that I will repeat many times is this is everyone's priority. I see my role as more of a guide to basically navigate as well as bring people into this, into this journey. But I'm not the beginning or the end of the journey. My job is to guide through the journey, and having all your partners at the table, maybe some of them are not there yet from their maturity perspective, but giving them the time to also have that maturity. And in the meantime, we spoke about use cases and experimentation to move things forward. So I think I'll leave it there just in the interest of time. So over to you, Vic.
Thank you, Vidya. And Teresa, it's yours to pick whichever answer you wish to give us.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely, I can tackle the culture change because culture change is super interesting. Whether we talk about music or clothing or just even people's mindsets towards, towards various political ideologies, culture change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's a part of a larger piece. And, it's funny, I'll talk to friends who live in the Philippines and we'll talk about kids. And they'll have the same challenges on the other side of the planet that I have here when it comes to will lament and talk about how, our parents' generation didn't have that same thing, a different mindset. And again, you're separated by, half of, and yet there's sort of this zeitgeist, right, that exists. And I think that culture change is the same with digital, right? Like I look at my kids, they're absolute digital natives. They can't imagine a world without it. Meanwhile, I still, I still come from a world of paper when I first started working. So I think for us, it's really about embracing it all. And the culture change, don't focus just on the culture change because you're not going to succeed. There isn't enough training that you can provide that's going to, shift people's mindset. But walk the walk with them, understand their fears, understand the things that concern them, and show them the art of the possible. Walk them through that process. And, we will see quickly how things can evolve and adapt, and people's mindsets will change.
Thank you, Teresa. We're right on the dot here. I want to thank Dr. Srivastav from Health Canada, Vidya, of course, from Agriculture, Teresa, yourself from Transport Canada. I want to again give a big shout out to Mehrdad Hariri for their unflinching leadership of the great Canadian Science Policy Center for bringing us together. Teresa, I was saving what you said as well, that Doctor, I'd like to have all of us come back next year. So I'll talk to Mehrdad about that, because this conversation is one that needs to continue. Also, lots of questions in the Q&A that we couldn't get to. So another reason for Mehrdad to consider bringing us back. But again, thanks also to the Office of Chief Scientist at Natural Resources Canada, Victoria, Melanie, Sonia, Melissa, everybody who came together to make this event such a great conversation among friends. So thanks, everybody. And again, please look at the agenda for this conference. There's amazing complementary synergetic sessions. Please go to them. And we hope to be back next year to continue this excellent conversation. Thanks, everybody. Bye for now.
Thank you so much.